Yesterday, the United States Trade Representative delivered a document to Congress that effectively rewrote the rules of global commerce overnight. It was not a routine policy brief. It was the formal conclusion of a massive Section 301 investigation, and it immediately triggered proposed tariffs targeting 60 separate economies, representing nearly $3 trillion in annual trade. If you are watching this from Ottawa, Tokyo, Brussels, or London, the message is unmistakable. The brief illusion of a post-tariff reprieve is dead. The White House has just executed a brilliant, ruthless legal pivot, shifting its entire trade strategy from a vulnerable executive order to a deeply fortified statutory fortress. To understand how we arrived at this flashpoint, we have to look back at the chaotic sequencing of the last 18 months. The official story from Washington was that the administration wanted to protect American workers from global trade asymmetries. But here is the other half of that narrative, the part most mainstream media coverage completely missed. The administration was never planning to abandon its protectionist wall. It was simply waiting for the courts to test its scaffolding. Here is the timeline to keep things clear. In early 2025, the administration began using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, to levy sweeping tariffs on virtually every major American trading partner. For a year, that mechanism worked exactly as intended, generating a staggering $175 billion to $179 billion in federal revenue. To put that in perspective, that single tariff stream exceeded the combined annual budgets of the US Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice. It was a massive, unprecedented extraction of capital from global supply chains, and markets rapidly priced it in as a permanent fixture of doing business with the United States. Then came February 20th, 2026. In a landmark 6-3 decision titled Learning Resources in Coram re Trump, the Supreme Court of the United States struck a massive blow to this structure. Chief Justice John Roberts, leading an unusual cross-ideological coalition that included Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Jackson, ruled cleanly and directly. The court declared that IEPA does not grant the president unilateral authority to impose tariffs. That power, Roberts wrote, belongs exclusively to Congress. Instantly, 60 countries quietly celebrated. Wall Street expected immediate relief. Over 1,000 global businesses rushed to file for refunds on what had suddenly become $175 billion in potentially illegal overpayments. The global trading architecture breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing a definitive constitutional wall had been erected around American trade aggression. But that celebration was entirely premature. What most observers completely missed was the clinical precision of the White House backup plan. The administration did not panic. They simply switched legal tracks. Within hours of the Supreme Court ruling on the evening of February 20th, the President signed a new proclamation invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. This bypassed the court ruling by establishing a temporary 10% global tariff based on a different legal theory, a serious US balance of payments deficit. Section 122, however, was never the destination. It was temporary structural scaffolding designed to buy time. The real weapon was launched less than 3 weeks later, on March 12, 2026, when US Trade Representative Jameson Greer initiated a parallel comprehensive Section 301 investigation into those same 60 economies. Unlike IEPA, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 is a highly durable 52-year-old statutory tool. It has been tested, litigated, and upheld across multiple decades and multiple administrations. It was the exact mechanism used in 2018 to levy over $550 billion in duties on China, tariffs that the Biden administration not only left untouched but actually expanded in 2024 on electric vehicles, semiconductors, and solar cells. Section 301 requires a formal investigation, a public comment window, and a documented finding of an unreasonable or discriminatory foreign trade practice that burdens US commerce. It is slower than an emergency executive order, but once implemented, it is nearly impossible to dismantle in a court of law. The brilliant tactical maneuver here lies in the justification the USTR selected for this 60-nation dragnet: forced labor trade failures. The USTR constructed a dense, nearly 100-page report utilizing data from the UN International Labour Organization, which estimates that 27.6 million people worldwide are subjected to forced labour. The legal architecture of the argument is ironclad. The USTR asserts that when foreign governments fail to strictly enforce and maintain domestic bans on forced labour goods, they allow their domestic manufacturers to operate with artificially suppressed labour costs. This, by definition, creates an unfair discriminatory trade practice that severely burdens compliant American companies. By framing the issue around human rights and labour standards, the White House accomplished two strategic goals simultaneously. First, it insulated the policy from domestic political attack. Opposing these tariffs now requires politicians to awkwardly defend weak foreign labour enforcement. Second, and more importantly, it established the precise legal standing required to satisfy the statutory demands of Section 301. What appeared on the surface to be a sudden humanitarian awakening was in reality a total structural rebuild of the exact same tariff wall the Supreme Court had just demolished. The speed of this operation was breathtaking. The administration compressed a process that normally takes up to a year into just over 90 days. This urgency was dictated by a hard legal deadline. The Section 122 balance of payments tariffs carry a strict statutory limit of 150 days. They are set to expire on July 24, 2026. If the Section 301 findings were not ready by July, a dangerous gap would open. The US tariff wall would temporarily fracture, signalling weakness to the markets and disrupting federal revenue streams. That brings us to the explosive June 2nd announcement. The USTR finalised its findings and proposed a permanent dual-tiered tariff structure that segments the global economy into two distinct camps. The first tier faces an additional 12.5% tariff. This group comprises economies found to have no meaningful or effective enforcement of forced labour restrictions. It includes China, India, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, and Switzerland, the literal engine rooms of global manufacturing output. The second tier faces an additional 10% tariff. This group covers jurisdictions with partial or existing frameworks that the USTR nonetheless deemed insufficient. It includes the United Kingdom, Mexico, the European Union, Taiwan, Argentina, and crucially Canada. For Canada, this is a geopolitical catastrophe masquerading as a regulatory dispute. Our economy is structurally exposed to the American market in a way no other G7 nation can match. When Washington sneezes, Ottawa catches pneumonia. When Washington imposes a 10% blanket tax under the guise of labour enforcement, it threatens the very foundation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has made the strategy completely explicit, stating openly that these Section 301 duties are designed to permanently replace the expiring Section 122 framework. This is not a temporary negotiating tactic. This is the blueprint for a permanent structural realignment of American trade taxation. The Atlantic Council ran the numbers on this new regime based on current import volumes, and the results are chilling. A fully implemented Section 301 regime across these 60 economies will generate up to $169 billion in annual tariff revenue for the US Treasury. Notice that number. It perfectly matches and replaces the $166 billion to $175 billion collected under the unconstitutional IAPA framework before the courts forced US Customs to begin issuing refunds. The policy outcome was never truly about the humanitarian nuances of foreign labour supply chains. It was always about locking in an expanded, permanent revenue architecture and protecting domestic industrial capacity through executive flat. The macroeconomic consequences are already compounding in ways that are deeply unsettling to model. The Tax Foundation has already calculated that this broader tariff agenda represents the largest tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. It scales as a highly regressive tax, hitting low-income households 3 times harder as a percentage of post-tax income than those at the top of the ladder. Furthermore, S&P Global's analysis of 9,000 companies globally revealed that tariff friction had already cost international businesses an unforecasted $1.2 trillion, with nearly 2/3 of that cost passed straight down the line to everyday consumers. For corporate supply chain executives who spent the spring believing the Supreme Court had permanently cleared the tariff storm, June 2nd was a brutal, unvarnished wake-up call. The real terror for global markets is not the baseline 10% or 12.5% figures, it is the concept of structural stacking. Section 232 national security tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, delivering 50% duties on metals and 25% on foreign vehicles, remain fully active. If these new Section 301 duties are layered directly on top of those existing tariffs rather than replacing them, the effective tax rate on industrial inputs from historical allies like Japan, Germany, and Canada will cross a threshold that fundamentally shatters the economics of transnational manufacturing. We are no longer dealing with the erratic trade skirmishes of 2018. This is an organised, legally durable trade policy relay race. The Supreme Court locked one door, so the executive branch simply walked through another that most of the world didn't even realise was unlocked. The temporary scaffolding of Section 122 is coming down on July 24th, and the permanent concrete foundation of Section 301 is being poured right over the top of 60 sovereign nations. If you want to understand how these macro shifts will directly hit your capital, your business, and Canadian economic sovereignty before it registers on mainstream news networks, make sure you are subscribed to the Money Signals community and hit that like button. The global response is already mobilising across 3 separate tracks. Legal challenges are being drafted in Geneva, retaliation lists are being compiled in Beijing, and the European Parliament is actively debating the suspension of major transatlantic trade accords. The escalation loop is officially locked. But as the international community prepares for a prolonged legal and economic war with Washington, the most consequential question remains entirely unanswered. That unanswered question centres on a stark reality. How do 60 highly distinct, globally competitive economies respond to an existential economic squeeze when the traditional avenues of international legal recourse have been completely neutralised? The answer lies within the hidden architecture of the Section 301 policy itself, a mechanism specifically engineered to exploit the asymmetric leverage of the American consumer market while trapping foreign capitals in a beautifully designed regulatory maze. To understand how this trap functions, we must look past the aggressive rhetoric and dissect the technical, granular terms of the policy announced by US Trade Representative Jameson Greer. This is not a blunt instrument. It is a multi-tiered, highly sophisticated economic weapon. First, the deal architecture relies on a strict, binary compliance matrix that deliberately upends traditional trade classification. The USTR has divided the targeted universe into 2 distinct buckets, based entirely on a unilateral American assessment of their domestic labour enforcement. Tier 1, carrying the 12.5% tariff penalty, is applied to nations categorised as having systemic enforcement failures with zero meaningful statutory compliance. Tier 2, carrying the 10% penalty, applies to nations that possess nominal legal frameworks against forced labour but lack what Washington terms verifiable, proactive supply chain audit mechanisms. By design, this criteria creates an immediate data asymmetry. To escape the higher tariff tier, a foreign nation cannot simply point to its domestic laws. It must actively invite or replicate US customs tracking systems, effectively exporting American regulatory jurisdiction into its own sovereign factories. Second, the financial terms are structured to maximize domestic revenue collection, while intentionally causing severe margin compression across international supply chains. According to internal Treasury estimates, the specific tariff rates, 10% and 12.5%, were calculated using an optimization model based on 2025 import elasticities. The goal was simple: find the exact mathematical threshold where tariff revenue matches the peak collections of the overturned IEPA framework without causing an outright collapse in import volumes. This creates a state of permanent capital extraction. The $169 billion in projected annual revenue is structurally insulated from future court challenges because Section 301 derives its authority from a specific, unambiguous congressional grant of power in the Trade Act of 1974. The money flows into the US Treasury, while the legal liability for paying those duties rests entirely on American importers of record, forcing private industry to serve as the tax collectors for the state. Third, the strategy incorporates a highly aggressive, compressed timeline that strips foreign governments of their standard diplomatic defense mechanisms. Under normal Section 301 procedures, an investigation takes 12 full months, allowing ample time for bilateral consultations, text adjustments, and negotiated exemptions. USTR Greer completely dismantled that convention by shortening the public comment and administrative hearing window to a mere 45 days. This hyper-acceleration was a deliberate tactical move to align the conclusion of the investigation with the July 24, 2026, expiration of the temporary Section 122 balance of payments tariffs. By eliminating the standard consultative window, the administration prevented the formation of a unified multilateral resistance front, forcing each of the 60 targeted nations to negotiate individually under the immediate threat of overnight implementation. To appreciate the sheer scale of the disruption this architecture causes, we must examine the specific exposure of the key players caught in the dragnet. The policy does not treat all 60 economies equally. Instead, it leverages individual vulnerabilities to fracture regional trading blocs. Consider the European Union, which represents one of the largest single nodes of trade with the United States. The Atlantic Council's quantitative modelling indicates that a 10% Tier 2 tariff on EU imports will extract approximately $34 billion annually from European exporters. This penalty lands directly on top of the existing Section 232 duties that still burden European steel, aluminum, and automotive components. The strategic implications for Brussels are devastating. For the past year, European trade officials have been quietly negotiating the Turnberry Trade Accord, a comprehensive framework agreement designed to stabilise transatlantic commerce and lower non-tariff barriers. The June 2 Section 301 announcement completely hollows out that accord. If a German automaker or a French industrial conglomerate faces a stacked effective tariff rate exceeding 25% on goods entering the United States, the Turnberry framework becomes economically irrelevant. The European Parliament is currently deadlocked over whether to suspend the ratification of the accord entirely, a move that would signal the formal end of transatlantic trade integration and force a desperate scramble for alternative markets that simply do not exist. Meanwhile, Tokyo and Seoul find themselves facing an even harsher economic calculus under the Tier 1 classification, classified under the 12.5% penalty tier due to their deep supply chain integration with Southeast Asian and Chinese components. Japan and South Korea face an annual combined tariff hit exceeding $10.6 billion. For decades, Japanese and South Korean industrial policy has relied on a highly efficient, multi-tiered supply chain where raw inputs are sourced globally, processed regionally, and assembled into high-value goods destined for American consumers. By targeting these nations for forced labor trade failures based on the components entering their secondary manufacturing lines, the USTR has effectively placed a tax on the entire Asian supply network. The immediate result is a severe valuation shock for complex electronic and automotive supply chains, rendering long-term corporate capital planning nearly impossible. Then there is Canada. For our audience on this channel, this is where the policy transitions from a global macroeconomic shift to an immediate structural threat to national sovereignty. Canada has been placed squarely in the Tier 2 category, facing a 10% blanket tariff on all exports crossing the southern border. The USTR's justification for including Ottawa is a masterpiece of regulatory cynicism. They allege that while Canada possesses robust federal bans on forced labour, its provincial enforcement mechanisms fail to provide the real-time tracking data necessary to verify compliance for transshipped goods. This is a direct, calculated assault on the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Under the USMCA, the North American market is supposed to operate as a highly integrated, tariff-free zone. Yet, by superimposing a Section 301 tariff over the top of the treaty, Washington has unilaterally rewritten the terms of the Continental Partnership. Think about the automotive sector alone, where parts cross the Canada-US border up to 6 times before a finished vehicle rolls off the assembly line. A 10% tariff applied at each crossing or even a single 10% penalty on the final assembly, completely eradicates the thin margins that keep Canadian manufacturing competitive. It forces global capital to make a binary choice: either move production entirely inside the US tariff wall or abandon the North American market altogether. This brings us to the core strategic logic driving the entire operation. The White House is not trying to fix global labour standards, nor is it trying to balance the federal budget with tariff revenue. The true objective is the forced, aggressive reshoring of the entire global manufacturing base. By creating an environment of permanent regulatory volatility, the administration is telling multinational corporations that the era of globalized, distributed supply chains is over. If a business wants guaranteed access to the American consumer, it can no longer rely on trade treaties, international court rulings, or foreign manufacturing hubs. It must build its factories on American soil, hire American workers, and operate under direct American oversight. What most analysts fail to realize is that this policy represents a complete rejection of the rules-based international order that has governed global trade since the end of the Second World War. The World Trade Organization has been rendered completely toothless, its appellate body remains paralyzed, and its rulings are openly ignored by Washington. By successfully executing this trade policy relay race, shifting seamlessly from IEEPA to Section 122, and finally to the permanent bedrock of Section 301, the administration has demonstrated that raw market leverage trumps international law every single time. 60 countries are now trapped inside an American-defined sandbox, and the traditional escape hatches have all been welded shut. Subbers to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on how these structural shifts are reshaping our economy. And ensure you are hitting that like button to help this content reach those who need to understand the real forces moving beneath the surface of the news. As foreign trade ministers arrive in Washington for emergency bilateral consultations ahead of the July 24th deadline, they are finding that the room for negotiation has shrunk to zero. The USTR is not offering broad exemptions. They are offering conditional compliance pathways that require foreign capitals to surrender significant regulatory autonomy in exchange for a minor tariff reduction. The leverage is entirely one-sided, and the economic pressure is mounting by the hour. But as the administration prepares to lock in this permanent new tariff architecture, a massive, highly dangerous structural flaw is beginning to appear at the very center of their economic model. By engineering a seamless transition from vulnerable executive emergencies to the permanent statutory bedrock of Section 301, the White House has constructed an unassailable tariff wall that extracts hundreds of billions of dollars while forcing 60 sovereign nations to accept American regulatory oversight or face immediate market exclusion. This architectural masterpiece has effectively weaponized global supply chains, converting a technical dispute over labor standards into a permanent apparatus for international industrial capitulation, the zooming out to the broader strategic chessboard. The implications of this structural shift extend far beyond corporate balance sheets or immediate trade balances. They represent the formal dissolution of the post-Cold War geopolitical consensus. For over 80 years, global stability was anchored by a grand American bargain. Washington would underwrite global security and guarantee open maritime trade routes, and in exchange, its allies would align with the Western democratic bloc. This morning, that bargain is officially null and void. By placing its closest historical partners, Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the European Union, into the exact same punitive tariff dragnet as its primary systemic rivals like China, the United States has signaled that geopolitical fidelity no longer buys economic immunity. The structural damage to Canada-US relations, in particular, is profound and potentially permanent. For generations, Ottawa's grand strategy has rested on the comfortable assumption of exceptionalism, the belief that our geographical proximity, integrated defence architecture, and shared resource grid guaranteed us a unique, privileged status inside the American orbit. The June 2 Section 301 Declaration shatters that paradigm completely. By imposing a blanket 10% penalty on Canadian exports, Washington is treating its largest trading partner not as a critical strategic ally, but as a compliance risk to be managed and taxed. This forces a complete re-evaluation of continental economic integration, proving that the USMCA is no longer an ironclad treaty, but a conditional framework subject to the unilateral reinterpretation of the American executive. Nowhere is this friction more dangerous than inside the critical sectors of energy, defense, and cross-border infrastructure. Consider the North American energy matrix. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil, electricity, and natural gas to the United States, sending over 4 million barrels of oil across the border every single day. Historically, this relationship was viewed through the lens of continental energy security, a mutually beneficial alliance that insulated North America from geopolitical shocks in the Middle East or Eastern Europe. Under the new Section 301 architecture, however, these vital flows are treated as raw commercial inputs subject to structural taxation. If a 10% tariff is permanently applied to Canadian energy exports, it acts as a massive regulatory drag on American refining infrastructure, while simultaneously draining billions of dollars from the Canadian capital expenditure pipeline. The defence industrial base faces an identical crisis of alignment. Under the decades-old Defence Production Sharing Agreement, Canadian and American aerospace and defence firms operate as a single, frictionless entity, co-developing everything from advanced radar systems to tactical components for the North American Aerospace Defense Command. By superimposing a parallel Section 301 enforcement regime onto this highly sensitive network, Washington has introduced massive transaction costs into the very heart of the Western security apparatus. A Canadian aerospace firm supplying advanced composite components for American fighter jets must now navigate an incredibly complex, multi-tiered bureaucratic audit to prove that no subcomponent touched an unverified foreign supply chain, creating operational delays that directly undermine continental readiness. To fully grasp the magnitude of this transformation, one must contrast this current landscape with the pre-Trump era of global commerce. In that lost world, international trade was defined by predictable, rules-based multilateralism. Capital moved fluidly across borders to maximize efficiency. Corporations constructed sprawling, just-in-time supply chains that spanned multiple continents, and disputes were adjudicated through the structured, sober mechanisms of the World Trade Organization. Tariffs were viewed as anachronistic relics of the 20th century, tools used only as a last resort in highly isolated agricultural or industrial disputes. Today, that entire intellectual framework has been utterly demolished. Efficiency has been completely replaced by resilience and national self-sufficiency as the organizing principles of statecraft. The World Trade Organization has been reduced to an administrative ghost, entirely bypassed by an American state that prefers raw, bilateral leverage over multilateral consensus. We have transitioned from an era of trade liberalization to an era of permanent structural economic warfare, where the tariff is no longer a temporary negotiating lever, but the foundational architecture of domestic industrial policy. This systemic realignment is already forcing an aggressive, painful fracturing of global alliances. Faced with permanent economic pressure from Washington, historical allies are being driven into unnatural, defensive coalitions. The European Union and Japan, historically hesitant to break ranks with the United States on major macroeconomic policy, are quietly exploring parallel trade mechanisms to bypass the dollar-denominated clearing systems that anchor American financial hegemony. More ominously, the USTR's simultaneous strike on 60 nations has provided Beijing with the perfect geopolitical opening. By launching its own parallel trade barrier investigations into American practices, China is attempting to position itself as the defender of global commerce, offering alternative supply chain architectures and preferential market access to nations currently suffocating under the weight of the US tariff wall. This channel will continue to track every move on this board with clear, fact-driven analysis that cuts through the noise of mainstream political spin. If you want to understand how these tectonic shifts are reshaping Canadian sovereignty and redefining the global distribution of wealth, make sure you are subscribed to Canada SR and have turned on notifications. The global trading system is now hurtling toward its next critical juncture, a hard administrative deadline that will determine the economic trajectory of the next decade. That date is July 24th, 2026. On that night, the temporary Section 122 balance of payments tariffs will officially expire and the newly finalised Section 301 permanent architecture will drop into place. Foreign capitals have less than 50 days to make a definitive strategic choice. They can either surrender their regulatory autonomy to Washington in exchange for a temporary tier reduction, or they can unleash their compiled retaliation lists, triggering a multi-directional, synchronized trade war that will fundamentally